Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to welcome back to the show Steve Magness. Steve, great to see you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Dan. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So am I. How long ago was it that you came onto the show? I think was it a couple of years ago now?
Yeah, it was. It's been a couple years, and I'm excited because I know we go back and forth on Twitter and social media all the time, and I just love the content that you put out both in this podcast and then on social media. And you're just a forward thinking thinker in this space. So
Well, we're going to dive straight into the mutual backslapping mode here, and I love your threads. You are Mr. Thread man, basically. I'm loving the threads you put out there. They look like they take a little bit of time to assemble.
yeah, it's funny. I try and be very deliberate and intentional on social media because I think it's kind of can be a cesspool.
Yes.
So my solution is, well, I'm just gonna try and put out good quality stuff and kind of be that counter voice. So it does take time. I mean, I sit there and assemble, just like I would an article or a blog on some of these things, but hopefully it's worth the effort and hopefully people find some value out of it.
Well, it's funny actually. I mean, we're going to be diving into your new book today, but before we do, I mean, speaking to your threads, I remember you doing a post not long ago saying that you spend a day a week or half a day a week really diving into a new subject, doing a deep dive, and obviously just sort of behind the scenes taking notes. And is that how you assemble those threads? Is you commit half a day to learning something new or refreshing your mind about a specific topic area, and then throwing it out in a thread?
100%. I'm a big fan of what I call down the rabbit hole days or
Yeah, yeah.
moments where I'll just be like, you know what, this is really interesting. Something catch my interest. I want to learn more about that, and I'll spend way too much time on Google Scholar or PubMed and just reading articles and going down the rabbit hole and going from one article to the next based on citations and really try and get a better understanding of things because I think for so much we kind of stay on the superficial level, and for a lot of things, like, that's okay, but like having that moment where you just go deep and you're just like, I'm gonna get lost in the nuance, complexity, all this stuff in it. And I think that's so valuable. So, but the key here is that thread really forces me to be like, okay, I just got lost. Now, what are the key takeaways? Like, what do I want to remember? So it's, yes, it's helpful for others, but it's also this kind of funneling mechanism for myself where I can take stuff that was really complex and hopefully simplify it so that not only others can use it, but I myself can too.
Awesome. And what I've actually just become aware of is in my excitement that you're on to talk about your book today, which I've loved reading, and I'm so looking forward to unpacking it. You've been on the Sports Site Show before, and so I know that just about everybody tuning in is going to know who you are. But I failed to ask you to reintroduce yourself to the audience. So maybe before we start unpacking your book, why don't you give us an idea of who you are, what you do, and just reacquaint all of us with who you are and your work.
Yeah, definitely. So my work is highly varied. So I struggle with this sometimes, but I think the simplest explanation is this: is I grew up as a very good runner, especially early on. So fell in love with running. That pushed me towards uh, exercise physiology, sports physiology, exercise science, all that stuff. That's where my background in academics is. Loved doing that, coached runners for a really long time, and then kind of zoomed out and said, hey, all this physiology is great, but man, it's the mental side of performance that really kind of makes the difference. Like, we're all writing the same workouts in slightly different ways. There's nothing magical here, but man, if I can get people to show up and perform on the right day and get them to, the freedom to perform, that's what it's all about. So I've really spent the last 5, 6, 7 years exploring that area, writing about it, not only in athletics, but also in terms of performance in the workplace and, physicians, executive entrepreneurs. Basically, it's all the same thing, as you know, whether you're lining up to run a race or, give a presentation. Performance is performance in my mind. So that's kind of who I am. I would say I'm a serial dabbler and hopefully deep explorer of interesting topics.
Well, your passion for the mental side of things has led you to explore quite a few psychological topics over the years that have informed the books, the articles that you've written, and you've got this new book out. And not to disappoint us, you're doing another deep dive on the mental side of sport, of life. And this time you're looking at toughness. Your new book is called Do the Hard Things: Why We Get Resilience Wrong and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness. I've read this book. I really, really enjoyed it. We think alike. As you said, we share a lot of messages on Twitter and some direct messages, sharing some ideas and some thoughts. So I'm unsurprised that I love your new offering. But tell me a little bit about the genesis of this book, Steve. Why toughness? Take me from the very beginning. Where this started for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a long history with, I would say, wrestling with adversity and how to navigate discomfort.
Oh, yes.
And there's two things that I think are important that has really shaped my understanding and why we got to this point. And we'll go, unlike other podcasts, we'll go all the way back. Okay. First is my running career. Okay. Because running is, what is it? It's being alone in your head. No one else can help you, and you just have to navigate things. And early in my career, I thought like, oh, well, this is simple. I'm just going to put my head down and force my way through things and grit it out. And I was notorious in high school for almost always like throwing up or puking after races. Like that was my like MO. That's what I was known for. So I took great pride in like, oh, I can push myself. But what I quickly realized is that like that is one tool in the toolbox. And there would be races where I dig deep and I'd be like, okay, here's the moment I'm gonna press. And there was literally nothing I could do. There was nothing there. It wasn't like, oh, push harder. And what that made me realize as an athlete is like, hey, I've got to broaden my toolbox. I've got to figure out how to navigate discomfort in a variety of ways. So that's number one. That's really kind of early on shaped my thinking of like, okay, here's a problem. How do we solve this? And then the second part of it is goes even further back. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, but not in depth, is that I've had OCD since I was a child. So I remember being 4 or 5 years old and, being scared to death that, if I didn't follow a certain ritual, like I was going to die. So my OCD was around like harm, which was essentially if anything that triggered that, like this harm reflex, like if I saw a giant knife, right? My brain would just spiral out of control and start to think like, oh, there's a knife, like that could stab you, like you could stab yourself, you're going to die, like here's this anxiety, these thoughts, etc., that just like all compress into one and convince you that this danger is entirely real. So having gone through that, especially, when I was young and I had no idea, and it just seemed like, oh, I must be a little crazy before I knew what OCD was, that really shaped like, okay, here's these thoughts and this feeling and all this stuff that's going in my head. And I learned quickly early on, if I try and like shun that away and push that away or ignore it, like it would come back 10x, right? It just wasn't helpful. So I had to learn, before, seeing therapists or getting help or anything like that, because this was, in the US, in the South, in the US in Texas in the 1990s. So mental health wasn't where it is today. But I really had to kind of learn on my own of like, okay, how do I navigate this stuff? In those two experiences especially shaped has I think always put this concept in my head of like, hey, let's rethink toughness. Let's like, what does it mean to be tough? Because to me, like, toughness is that navigating part. It's we all feel those doubt settings, insecurities, the anxiety, maybe the crazy thoughts that go with it sometimes. Well, how do we navigate that inner world? So that it's been, I guess the summary, Dan, is it's been in my head for a really long time, and I just think it took until now to really have the knowledge and expertise, and then also the language to kind of hopefully piece things together and pull things apart where it's usable.
This is your fourth book. Listening to what you're saying, it sounds like this may have been the most meaningful write for you.
Yes, I think so. And the other thing about it is a lot, since it's so personal, let me step back. It's easier to write about things when they aren't as personal, right? It's easier to say, hey, I have this experience maybe coaching others in performance, and let's write about that because it contributes, it helps others. Yes, I deal with it. But like with toughness, as you've just heard, like it's something I've thought about, like wrestled with for so long personally,
Mm,
that I think you really have it's almost like you want to get it right,
mm.
because you're like, okay, this is my one shot, one opportunity to like maybe put a different narrative out there. So like let's do this right.
Talking about different narratives, this is where you start this book. The introduction is essentially entitled "How We Got Toughness Wrong and Where to Go." Steve, how have we got toughness wrong?
Yeah, that's a big one to unpack. But I think what it is pretty simple. Is if you look around, when we think toughness, we often have this particular image in our head, and it's kind of related to what I talked about earlier, which is like, what do we do? Well, we put our head down, we grind through, we grit it out. If you're a boy, or a man, you've been told like, just ignore what you're feeling, ignore the experience, ignore the emotions, like just grit your teeth and grind through. If you have doubts or insecurities, we've been told that's kind of a sign of weakness. And this goes beyond sport. It's not just sport. We often see it in coaching and athletics and all that stuff. But if you look at even ideas, especially in the US around parenting, it's like, oh, we have to be, there's a large portion of the population that thinks like demandingness, disciplinarian, authoritarian view of parenting is the way to go. If you look at, politics, there's we've got to be tough. Every politician, has written a book about like resilience or fortitude or whatever have you. And their ideas are often like conflated with strength and power and control. And I think if we frame toughness in this way of strength, power, control, authoritarianism, like, you know, we lose out because we've essentially narrowed our world to these external factors, right? Where it becomes the appearance of something instead of the actual thing. And that's what I've kind of seen with this toughness is we're obsessed with this appearance of strength, but what toughness really is it's just navigating discomfort. It's navigating those anxieties, that inner, chaos that I talked about that I experience with myself. And as you know, navigating means there's a myriad of ways around it. And the best way isn't to ignore and push and whatever. The best way is to say, hey, how am I going to find this way through? And sometimes that way through is through acceptance or reframing or dealing with it. But we need those options. And I think that's the message that is lost.
Do you think we found ourselves in this relationship with toughness in the manner that you're describing, this control, this authoritarianism, because that almost feels like the simple route. Negotiation is the negotiation that you talk about is actually complex and nuanced, and we're obviously going to unpack that. But that feels complex and nuanced, and we both admitted to using Twitter avidly, and you can't fail to see the simplistic memes around toughness, especially. I don't know. I'll poke a bit here at basketball. I see, say, clips of a basketball coach sometimes speaking in simplistic tones about toughness, or seeing some simple meme about toughness, and you can guarantee, Steve, it's got about 20,000 likes and quoted retweets saying, yes, read this, and the finger pointing down and right on, and it's like, whoa. But these memes tend to be so simplified and basic, and a complete fallacy around toughness, in my opinion.
I think you're spot on. And I think it's kind of ironic because it's the simple and the easy path.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because think about it. What's easier or simpler in terms of maybe even leading people? Like, think about it. If I just say it's my way or the highway, like, I'm in power, I'm in control, you must do what I say, and if you don't, I'm going to make you do some absurd like punishment exercises until you comply. That's simple, because you don't have to create relationships. You don't have to create buy-in. You don't have to create trust. You just dictate and demand. And I think in that same way, like, this toughness is the same thing. It's almost excuses you, right? And I saw this as a coach as well, as like, it excuses you from having to figure out the difficult thing. So if I'm a coach and someone like doesn't perform well, what's the simplest thing to do? Well, I can blame the athlete. I can say, "Oh, you're just not tough enough. Like, you gave up. You didn't push through the pain. You've got to learn now. You've got to push through the pain." And that takes the responsibility away from like me saying, "Okay, as a coach, what does that mean? Why weren't they able to perform? Like, what tools do they not have that don't allow them to rise to the occasion?" So in many ways, the simple message works because it like takes kind of the pressure off the coach or the leader, because like they have this excuse to not deal with it, because it's like, oh, you're just not tough enough. Oh, you just didn't push through. Like, that you didn't do this simple thing that like the Twitter gods tell us that is required.
And I don't want to take us down this rabbit hole here, but it's for me, Steve, and I have conversations about this a lot with coaches. It's that classic notion of, well, you can control your attitude, effort, and energy, and maybe we can throw toughness into the mix there. You can control your attitude, effort, and energy, and toughness. You've got to bring that to the court, the course, the pitch, the field. I can't do that for you. Externalizes locus of control, doesn't it? And it robs players, people, of the opportunity to experience an environment where maybe those tools, techniques, philosophies can be introduced to them. But it also, interestingly, in the mid to long term, robs the coach of the capacity to find out just how good they can be.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and that's certainly a rabbit hole we can go down. But I think you're spot on. I mean, it's again kind of ironic is that as a coach, when you go down that path, like, you're essentially limiting what kind of coaching and teaching you can do, right? Because you've taken away that control, you've taken away that autonomy. I like to say, when we're training some of these mental skills, that if the athletes don't have a choice, nothing is getting learned, right? If I sit there and I say, you have to do this or else there's, X, Y, and Z in punishment, the athlete, you've taken away the autonomy. They have no control. When they don't have a choice, toughness cannot be learned, because Here's what it is. What is toughness? It's navigating and making the wise decision when you're under chaos, uncertainty, and stress. Well, what's the wise decision? You have to have options. What we're trying to do over the long haul is ingrain this pathway, like clear this pathway towards like doing the hard thing, and we have to clear the path where we have that choice. And if you make that choice over and over and over again, then you get a little more comfortable with being uncomfortable. If you don't have that choice, the example maybe that to illustrate this is, and I see this all the time in American sports, especially American football, is if the strength coach, for example, is standing over the athlete, screaming at them to finish their burpee or final rep or whatever have you, sure, that might help in that moment. But what's the athlete going to do when the strength coach isn't screaming at them in the game? Because they're not. The athlete isn't going to listen on the sidelines from that coach. Like, he's in the game or out on the field or out on the course by himself. Like, you've got to ingrain that they want to do it, that they can do it, that they don't need that person threatening, screaming at them in order to get this final, rep in at a quality enough thing.
Only you can see my smile here. This is probably where I need to record this, but I'm smiling because, again, and this is just our opinion here. This is our experience. The conversations I've had, let's say, with sports science and coaches alongside sports science, saying, well, we can be those cheerleaders during our fitness sessions, for example, and even during the activities, when we're coaching. But we have to remember that we're squashing players' capacity to upskill themselves to be able to support themselves, under pressure when they need to. I completely concur. I mean, in many respects, we're going to be going down this rabbit hole anyway, because the whole book really is based on, that navigation to be able to make wise decisions through uncertainty and stress. And the way that you've structured this book is by introducing the reader to four pillars of toughness. And these pillars of toughness are, as we're talking here, they're the nuanced and the more complex side of looking at this, rather than something that's obvious. So we're going to take this piece by piece here. Let's talk about the first pillar of toughness. And you entitle this section of the book, Ditch the Facade, Embrace Reality. Talk to me a little bit about ditching the facade and embracing reality, Steve.
Yeah, I think so much of it is we are told to like fake it, to like, it's just we hold on to this idea that we shouldn't like see things as they are, right? We should go in with incredible optimism. We should have this incredible confidence. We should come in with this bravado, this external bravado, and all this good stuff. And the reality is that doesn't work. That backfires. The thing to do with like any difficult thing is you need to see it clearly. And if you look at the research in psychology, is there needs to be a high overlap between your kind of perceived perception of the demands and your capabilities,
yep,
and then the actual demands and capabilities. The way I like to, get this message across is if I lined up for a marathon and I said, you know what, I'm the best. Like, this is going to be a piece of cake. I've got this. This is no problem. Well, what happens when halfway through reality smacks me in the face and it actually starts to hurt? Well, my brain is primed for expectations of like, oh, I've got this. This isn't going to be a problem. I'm the toughest, fastest person ever. Well, reality always wins because your brain is very protective. And once it hits that sensation of fatigue, discomfort, doubt, etc., it's going to sound the alarm if it wasn't prepared for it, right? You're going to almost freak out because your brain's going to be like, what the heck? This wasn't supposed to be difficult. Like, this was supposed to be a piece of cake. And that alarm gets sounded like 10x or louder than it would if it knew what was going to come. So it's much better to, if you're going into that marathon, is not to go in with like extreme doubt and pessimism and despair, because that sets, again, another unrealistic expectation. If you go on that extreme, then your brain's going to be like, well, I'm not going to loosen the reins at all. We're not going to get close to discomfort because this is going to be the worst thing in the world. The best approach is in the middle, which is, what do you think you're capable of? What's the actual experience going to be like? And match that up as best as you can. Because when you approach things like that, when it inevitably gets hard, then you're prepared. Your brain is like, okay, it was supposed to be hard at mile 15, 16, 17. Like, this isn't a surprise. And I think, whether we're talking the marathon or other things, when we look at embracing reality and having like the evidence of the work we've done shape our confidence, our understanding of the demands, our understanding of the capabilities, it gives us that freedom to explore things and take on and do what we're capable of.
I think this is fascinating, and you've mentioned the marathon there, and I know in the book you do introduce these topics by stating that as a runner, as a seasoned runner, you'll principally be using examples from running, but you have a lot of stories from lots of different sports. But I think this is fascinating because listening to you, there's certain things running through my head in terms of, if I go into, there's probably not going to be a question here, but I'd be fascinated to get your response to some of these points. In this section, you do refer a lot to a theory, the challenge and threat states, which on the Sports Psych show we've spoken about quite a bit, and we've had some of the main authors on the show to talk about challenge and threat. And and I love what you're saying, because it makes me think of, if I stand there and I say, well, this is going to be simple, this is going to be easy, I'm the best player, I'm amazing, I'm the best runner, then we actually could be priming a threat response, because we're not readying ourselves. I've heard it described once as bracing yourself. Brace yourself for the race ahead. Brace yourself for the game ahead. So we can be priming a threat by not bracing ourselves. And what also, when you were speaking there, it was making me think of actually embracing discomfort, because you've got to find that shade of grey. You've got, as you said, we've got to find the middle. And I think as human beings, we love being on the far left-hand side or the far right-hand side, because that feels like there's certainty there. But we've got to find the middle. And so we've got to feel a little bit of discomfort in order to deal with the discomfort during the race. Those were the kind of thoughts that were coming in and out of my head there. Again, I said there wasn't going to be a question, but that's kind of what's going through my head.
I think you're spot on, and I'm glad you brought those both up, because that's what it's all about. That's kind of what I mean by embracing reality. And I love that you brought up priming, because how we frame things, both in terms of whatever demands we're going to face, but also in terms of like our internal sense of what we're capable of, like our confidence, all that kind of stuff. Like, we're essentially priming our brain for what's to come. Like, here's what we're going to face. And if we can have that overlap, we're going to either prime ourselves for that challenge state, or we're going to prime ourselves for our threat state. And I think it's kind of ironic, again, that some of the common notions of like how to be tough or whatever actually prime us to be threatened, right? Or prime us to be, come from insecurity, and that primes us to be threatened as well. And I think it's just fascinating to see that we're almost working against our biology with some of these common notions.
it reminds me again, as you're speaking there, in this section you refer to a conversation you had with a sports psychologist about, rather than going out to play your best game, actually refer to your average, or striving to improve your average. And it's not, I read that, and for me that resonates so much, because in my own consultancy, and again I'm going to come back to the word negotiation, I try to help players. So I work with a lot of soccer players and rugby players here in England. Try to help them negotiate this notion of, look, I'd like to have my best performance, or close to my best performance. Of course I'd like to, but I've also got to brace myself and be ready to have my best possible performance. And some days a 6 out of 10 is going to be a damn good performance. So that really, what you wrote that about, that conversation you had with the psychologist, and that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I think that's such an important concept, because I think we spend so much time focused on what I'll call the ceiling, that peak performance, the one that is our best ever. And it doesn't always come. It's very rare, in fact. If you're, in a sport like running or swimming or cycling that's time based, the better you get, the fewer and farther between those personal best, personal records are. So I think much better is to focus what I call the floor, which is,
Yeah.
what can I do consistently almost no matter what? I want to raise that floor so that my average performance is better. And if my average performance is better, then that gives me the opportunity, when the world aligns and everything's clicking, that my great performance can be even higher.
Now, tell us about the next section. We've covered that first section. Tell us about the next section of the book.
Yeah. So the second pillar is essentially, we need to learn how to communicate with discomfort, which I think so often we think that we should, or are told that we should ignore our emotions, like push away the feelings, like don't listen to your voice, that doubt in your head. And I think that's backwards, because if we look at it, is first off, our feelings and emotions, as you've done some wonderful podcasts on this, but they're essentially information. They're how our body communicates with us. They give us feedback. Now, some of that information is going to be very good, right? If I don't know, if I get a cut on my hand, like that pain signals like, hey, maybe you should do something about this. Or if I put my hand under boiling hot water and I pull away, that pain is a good signal. Other times, maybe that signal is something that, well, it's important. I shouldn't listen to. And that's what it's about, is it's about figuring out, again, we're going to use that word, navigate. Navigate means understanding what your feelings and emotions are communicating with you, so that you can make the decision, like, is this important or is this not? In the athletic realm, I like to use the example that every athlete has to learn pretty early on, which is that pain signaling an injury that means I should stop? Or is that pain just something, that will go away, that I don't need to listen to, that I can just be like, oh, okay, that makes sense, but I'm just going to continue on and see if this gets better or worse. Making that distinction is incredibly important. And I think that helps us make better decisions.
Is that something you've experienced yourself? That, I'm now going to use this word again, negotiation. Through during a race, whether it's yourself, Steve, or whether it's somebody you've been training, that actually during a race you can have that negotiation. You've got to tap into to your emotions. You've got to listen to your body and make decisions based on what you experience.
Oh, 100%. And this is, I think in the past you've had some guests who have gone over like concepts like emotional granulation and like bringing context into things. And in my own career as an athlete and then helping others, like I tell them, you got to understand the nuance, because in the middle of a race, you're going to have all these feelings, all these emotions, like almost bombarding you. And some are going to be, and you got to be able to separate those out. So in my own career, like I can tell you, for example, if I'm running a race, whether the sensation of pain and discomfort means, fatigue in my legs that can be limiting, or if it means fatigue that's coming from maybe an energetic source, meaning I need some carbohydrates, or fatigue that pain discomfort that is coming from actually a lack of like focus and I'm disengaging. And if I can re engage in the moment, it'll dissipate. But the only way we can understand that nuance to understand what the message is, because I'm going to handle each of those situations differently, right? Is to be able to
Yeah.
like sit with that discomfort, understand the message, the feelings, the message they're communicating, so that then I can find that best path forward.
It makes me think of, this is what experience is, isn't it? This is where experience can be so important in the athletic realm, and it makes me think of the importance of athletes paying attention to their inner experiences, their inner sensations, and in granular detail, striving to identify what they mean. Because if you do that and you grow those insights, or if they actually if that process becomes an insightful experience, you can use that in future races to enable you to make smarter decisions.
100%. And I think, this is why, and this applies to not just runners, but all athletes, is I often give the advice in practice is occasionally let your mind go to a dark place.
Mm.
Because if you can experience that, then you can kind of start to pick apart and see and understand the nuance and understand what those feelings and emotions are telling you, so that then whether to listen, whether to just let them float on by, how to navigate things in a much better manner. So I think that experience is vital, but the key to experience is what? We can have the same experience. We can have, 10 years of experience, but it's 1 year of experience repeated 10 times, or we can have 10 years of experience. And I think the difference, what makes it is, are we paying attention? Are we learning and growing? Are we dissecting these things? And I think so often we just aren't. We're just taught like, oh, just ignore that. Like it was a bad day. Like don't think about it, etc. But if you dive into it and you understand it, it's going to set you up better in the future.
It's like I say to my clients, intentionally pay attention to garner insights. Those insights are the things that are going to set you apart, or help you get into the team, develop your game, create career longevity. In this section, the second pillar, chapter 6, it almost feels like you pose an interesting juxtaposition here, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Chapter 6, you talk about, emotions are messengers. Emotions, feelings, they're going to emerge. These inner sensations are going to emerge. You're going to experience them. Pay attention to them because they're sending you a message. Chapter 7, you talk about owning the voice in your head. So on the one hand, we've got inner sensations coming up, popping up, and we've got to experience them and decipher them. But then you talk about owning the voice in your head. Talk to me a little bit about owning the voice in your head, because I suppose that automatically sends me towards more of that traditional form of toughness, if you like.
Yeah, so I think the voice in your head, a lot of this comes from sport, but it also comes in my
Okay.
my experience with navigating or dealing with OCD, which is the voice in your head, you got to understand it, which is it can either be you directing it, or it can be voices, doubts, insecurities that pop up. And what I realized with OCD is that in certain times you are not your thoughts, right? You've got to disconnect that. And that OCD, you experience this voice that's telling you, like, I don't know, you're going to do this bad thing, or this is going to harm you. And the reality is that's just like something that's fake, right? It's just a wrong message, a security alarm that's gone, too hyper involved. So here in this chapter, I kind of, try to help the reader understand where those voices come from, and then importantly, how to use those, right? And I think this is the main point, which is it's not to ignore or push away. It's to be able to understand, like in my case, I label it. I say, oh, that's just my OCD voice. And that tells me, like, oh, that's my OCD voice. I don't have to assign a lot of meaning to it, right? I don't have to give it a lot of volume or importance because that's just my OCD voice. The same thing applies when we're looking at how we're navigating discomfort in other pursuits, right? If certain doubts or insecurities pop up, like, you should label it, you should name it. And it's like, oh, that's just my, kind of hypochondriac voice that is keeping me in check, reminding me that this thing is going to be a little bit dangerous. But I've dealt with the danger, so I'm okay. And then the other part of the voice that I think is important is how we talk to ourselves. Is essentially, it allows us to have that discussion, that dialogue, that negotiation with our brain and body. So, you know, one of the things that research clearly shows is if we can create some psychological distance, then, you know, that's more powerful than just us feeling like, hey, this is me and my voice. What do I mean by this? Well, if I were to, go to a relationship or marriage counselor, for example, they might tell me, hey, when you're making decisions or when you're thinking about this, think of it as if, your friend, what advice would your friend give you? Why do they tell you to think of what would your advice your friend give you? Because that creates distance. Because, when we're too intertwined, we can't navigate things very well because it's like there's a consequence on us, it's too connected, all that good stuff. So you say, what advice would your friend give you? That creates space. We can do the same thing with talking to ourselves. How we can change from first person to third person, or my favorite, which is when we say something out loud, we take our inner voice and make it outer, you know, and say, hey, in the middle of, when I'm walking up to give a speech, I can say, hey, Steve, you've got this. You're prepared. Well, when I say that out loud, it's almost like a more primitive version because we developed outer speech before inner speech. If you look at child development, so outer speech is almost like that friend telling me something because it's coming from the outside. Almost, I'm hearing it. My brain somewhat interprets it as like something else, someone else giving that, so it has a more powerful effect. So the whole point of this chapter is like, hey, you can be in charge of understanding and then dictating or telling yourself, what your self talk is. And I think that's such a powerful tool that we need to utilize more.
I love it. I love it. Zooming out, distancing, looking from the outside in. The third pillar of toughness: respond instead of react. Respond instead of react. Take us through this.
So here, I like to call it, it's almost like we've talked about negotiation a lot. Well, how do you do that? If you're reactive, that means it's like this instant. It's like it's that feeling of defensiveness. It's that feeling of pushing away. It's that feeling of like, oh my gosh, like this is a negative thing. I can't deal with this. And you're just going to quickly react. Whenever we react, bad things happen. Okay. Because we tend to go down the easy path, the simple path, right? What we want to do is to keep our mind steady, to keep our mind clear so that we can have that conversation, that negotiation. So if you look at what they do in the special forces, for example, everybody thinks military, oh, they're tough. Like they just do really difficult things. But if you look at what they teach them, it's essentially how to keep a clear, steady mind while chaos is going around you. Well, how do you do that? You develop your ability to respond, which if you look at, again, I'll take you from the military to experts in meditation. What is meditation about? It's about sitting with a thought or sitting in silent and not reacting to the thoughts or feelings that come into your head. Well, when you practice that non-reactiveness, what it trains is it takes that alarm down a little bit, right? You don't freak out. You don't hit the panic button. And when you don't hit the panic button, then you're able to respond, which is, hey, what am I trying to do? Is this the right direction? What's the consequence of this? All of that good stuff. So the better you're able to keep your mind steady and have a calm conversation, I think the better off you are to navigate these difficult moments.
Is it important to keep your body steady as well? I mean, do you think we need to manage our physiology in that moment?
Oh, I think 100%. I mean, essentially what we're trying to do here is you're trying to make your physiology work with you and not
Yeah.
against you. It
Okay.
comes back to that, like, that alarm response. Is so often the tendency is just send the alarm. As I said earlier, our brain is protective. So when it thinks it's in danger, it's going to sound the alarm. And your job is to sit there and be like, nope, I'm going to make my physiology work with me, right? And that can come in a million different ways, right? We can think about it and navigate the inner dialogue like we talked about. We can act so that our body then follows through almost as like a priming mechanism as well. Because if we go into things and we kind of cower and we get kind of quiet and go inwards and constrict, well, our body is our body and brain are going to constrict as well, because it says, hey, this is evidence, this should be a threat response, so like we're not ready this. So it's your body and your mind together, like preparing you for the hard thing.
Inhibition rather than approach. We want approach rather than inhibition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Take things on.
That fourth pillar, um, transcend discomfort. So we're coming back around to managing our discomfort. Talk to me a little bit about this fourth and final pillar.
So this is I think one of the most important ones, and I think most valuable, because so far we've talked about, okay, how do you as a person kind of navigate discomfort? But this brings it back out to two things. Is one, in order to navigate discomfort, we have to have a foundation. If I am in an environment that is very controlling, that sabotages, me, that makes me feel unvalued and not respected and like I have no autonomy and control, do you think I'm going to be able to handle difficult things? Of course not. I mean, there's decades of research, both in sport, but more so in business, where if you work with a boss who is just kind of cruel and controlling, you don't persist as long. You're more likely to quit and burn out and all these other things. So, number one is transcending discomfort is about building that foundation. What is that foundation? I think it comes back to our basic psychological needs, right? We need to feel kind of valued. We need to have autonomy. We need to have a sense of control. We need to feel like we belong. We need to feel like we can progress in whatever we're doing and not feeling like we're stuck. And in the sporting world, so often, as we talked about at the very beginning of this podcast, is if you choose that power and control, the simple, you're thwarting all of those things that allow people to thrive. And you've put people in a survive mode. We don't perform as well. We don't handle the hard things as well if we're in survival mode. And then the other thing I think of this transcending discomfort part is that we also know that if our pursuits have meaning, then we're able to dig a little bit more. Then we're able to survive a little bit more. Then we're able to turn, stress into growth. And I think coming back to no matter what you're doing is if you can find different sources of meaning and diversify that meaning for whatever task or pursuit you're exploring, that's going to help in the long haul. So as leaders, what does that mean? I think it means you've got to find meaning in the games that you're playing beyond, hey, we're just trying to win, or like we're trying to defeat this opponent. When you can have something mean something greater than just like your individual self, then you're going to be able to navigate difficult things much better.
As you're speaking there, it makes me think how important this final pillar is for coaches. It's all important for coaches, of course it is. But maybe if one was to categorize each pillar, you might say the first three pillars are it's not divorced. They're not divorced from coaching at all. They're very coach relevant, and coaches can help players, people upskill themselves in the skills, the techniques that you talk about in those first three pillars. But as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the importance. You mentioned the environment. That's what this pillar is all about: is creating an environment where people, players, athletes can thrive and flourish. They experience autonomy and the opportunity to demonstrate competence, and that it's a meaningful environment for them because perhaps they can relate to the environment that you're actually creating, because they're involved, or the organization as a whole provides greater meaning for them to attach to. So it's such an important pillar for coaches to read, to pay attention to, and then to start executing various things across their environmental landscape.
Yeah, I think so. And this was honestly, I think the most fun chapters or section to write, because as a coach, I think it's kind of the glue that we forget
Mm.
that holds things together. Because if you can create that environment, like so often in sport, we talk about culture. But if you look at the research and then you look at and talk to the best actual teams and cultures, it's they're essentially filling their athletes' basic needs. Like they're being decent human beings and treating others as decent human beings on the journey to grow together. And if you can do that, then a lot of the rest takes care of itself. But and I want to drive this point home, that is the more difficult thing to do. The easier route is the cheap route, which is like power, control, authority, right? Because then everybody obeys and I don't have to think about creating stuff. But that doesn't
No.
last and it doesn't work. It doesn't work over the long haul. So creating an environment where people can thrive is what it's all about.
And there are possibly some graphic illustrations in European soccer where that authoritarian approach has demonstrated either to not work or not to last, even if it works at the beginning of, let's say, a managerial tenure or a head coach tenure. Let's go full circle here. You open the book referring to Bobby Knight, the basketball coach, the famous or infamous basketball coach, who obviously, as you point out, experienced what could be construed as a great deal of success. And he was a coach of his time, and the landscape has changed in part because things evolve, and because of great books like this and greater education and a sort of perhaps more uh, um, educated understanding of how human beings flourish and thrive and function and perform and learn and develop. Perhaps the internet has enabled the coaching community and others to learn the nuances and the complexities. I mean, if you could talk to Bobby Knight, or if you could go back to that era, do you personally think, and one can only hypothesize, but do you think if he injected some of this content into his coaching culture, what do you think might have happened? Do you think he might have won as many trophies? Or do you think it might be a case of he may have compromised on the trophies, but perhaps his players, his people would have had a greater experience? What's your thoughts on that?
Oh man, that's a good question. That's a good what
And
if.
I don't think there's a straightforward answer, is there? I
Yeah.
wouldn't. Yeah.
There, there's not, and I think it is important to say it was a different time and different
Yeah.
era. But I would say this is if you look at not the exact era, but a little bit before and overlap to a degree. If you look at someone like John Wooden,
Mm,
who took the opposite approach, right? And won many more championships over the long haul. It tells me that even in that era, right, which was different, like these things of, creating the environment where people can thrive and not being the authoritarian, etc., could work and could succeed. And I think if you look at coaches who have succeeded with this authoritarian control, it's few and far between, especially as we go into the modern era. But those who have at least, figured out how to win in whatever way. And that's what allowed them to keep around. So the example I'll give to maybe not exactly answer your question, but a lot of people when I've talked about this, they've said like, well, what about Bill Belichick in the NFL? He's like very authoritarian. And I don't know the intricacies of his work, but what I would say is, yeah, in whatever environment Bill Belichick has created with the New England Patriots, it's worked well.
mm,
Like I can't discount that at all. But if you look at every just about every single assistant coach who has come from there, who's tried to import the same environment anywhere else in the NFL, it has failed.
mm.
The kind of very demanding. Now, why is that? I don't know. I don't know. But there's something to it where it's like even the examples of this kind of authoritarian control that has led to maybe winning, like it doesn't seem to export at all very well. So that tells me for whatever reason, you know, in their little environment, maybe coaches like Belichick have figured out how to thread a needle that others are missing or what have you. So to me, it sends a message that yeah, maybe you get lucky like that and you work, but you look at the data, you look at the research, you look at the experience, and it all shows that you know, pushing in the other direction is what A is sustainable over the long haul. B, it doesn't discount or it doesn't take away from winning. And then C, most importantly, is it helps people, helps the athletes you coach or lead be decent human beings who are set up to succeed after their sporting careers. And I think that's
I
important.
think it's really interesting. You cannot. I'm guessing. I would suggest that you cannot replicate what somebody else does because you just don't know the complex nuances in the manner in which they're doing those things. And I suppose at the moment there may well be a lot of coaches. In fact, I know there are who are out there, let's say, striving to replicate what the way Marcelo Bielsa, the soccer coach, the incredible Argentinian soccer coach, has done things over the years, and actually some head coaches I know have potentially lost their position as a consequence of just not being able to replicate what he did in the manner in which he has done those things. And just actually on Bill Belichick, it's really interesting that you brought him up. And I'm an Englishman who is not an expert on NFL, although I appreciate and could see myself really getting into the sport. But he is incredibly successful, and yet has at the same time, for me personally, one of the most annoying quotes that I find that coaches say to me is the quote, just do your job. Just do your job, which to me in a team sport is absolutely mind blowing because it's like, not, well, probably not, because we probably want our players to do their jobs and to help others to do their jobs as well. We want task cohesion and social cohesion and shared mental models here, Steve. We just don't want somebody to go out there and do their job. I don't know if that's my little rant of the day.
Yeah, maybe this will tie it together. This is why I often remind myself that even the best of the best coaches what they're doing, they're probably getting about 70 to 80% of it right.
Yeah.
But that means there's 20 to 30% that they do that isn't right, that probably gets in their way, that backfires, all of this stuff. Yet we try to copy them, or what their perception is, 100% right. And what often happens is people pick up on the things that, might be backfiring for them, but they copy those and then they don't work. So it's our job as practitioners to understand that even the greats don't get everything right, and we need to make sure that we're not copying something that maybe they did wrong, but they had enough right things that go in their way that it didn't matter.
Brilliant. Great way to end today. And look, Steve, it's a fantastic book, and I know that you will have tapped the interest of everybody out there, all of the Sports Psych Show audience. So, how can people get a hold of your book?
Yeah, so it's called Do Hard Things, and you can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, basically anywhere that sells books. It will be available, and if you find it interesting, drop me a line on social media at Steve Magness, and happy to chat about it.
And they can also check out your brilliant threads.
That's right.
Perfect. Well, look, Steve, I can't thank you enough for your time today, mate. Thank you so much. Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.